My name is Phillip Toney. I'm going to be talking about the Recovering America's Wildlife Act of 2023 for exam 2, the oral portion. So on the agenda, I'm going to give a synopsis of RAWA. I'm going to talk about how it could become a law. We'll talk a little bit about state and tribal wildlife grants as well as state wildlife action plans. And then we'll talk a little bit about how all of these connect here in Alaska where I live. So to give a little bit of background on RAWA, it was a bill that was introduced in Congress in July of 2016 to secure funding for conservation efforts. They were requesting about $1.3 billion, and this was, again, designed to provide resources to wildlife professionals who are working conservation efforts, and especially for species of greatest conservational needs. It was also designed to amend the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act, which was passed in 1937. And this was very similar in that it was to provide funding for wildlife restoration, but also hunter education and conservation efforts. And this would work with the state fish and wildlife agencies to determine these species of greatest need and to implement and design conservation efforts for them through these supplemental funds. So it'd be funded entirely through the general fund of the Treasury, and you can see the amounts here. RAWA is kind of broken into three categories. The first one is wildlife conservation and restoration, and that's broken into 4 different years. So FY24 it starts out at $850 million, and that works its way up to FY27 and on at that $1.3 billion mark that I mentioned. The next one is the tribal wildlife conservation restoration. This one is FY24 and on at $97.5 million, and then the third one is the endangered species recovery and habitat conservation legacy fund. This is a 3-year plan from FY24 to 27 for $187.5 million. As I mentioned, RAWA was first introduced on July 11th, 2016. Over those next few years, it picked up a lot of support and a lot of steam, but it seemed like it could just never make it to the end. So in 2017 and 2018, because of certain species that were, starting to decline in population, it again started to pick up some steam. In 2018, it was introduced to the Senate, and it had 100 co-sponsors that year, but it wasn't able to make it into the final budget. Same thing happened in 2019 and in 2020. And in 2021, the bill was passed through the House and through the Natural Resources Committee. It was even endorsed by the Director of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, but again was left out of that final Senate spending bill, So now in 2023, it's got a lot of co-sponsors. It's got a lot of support from biologists and Native communities, bipartisan support. And so we're looking to see if all of that support can carry it on through the Senate finally. As I mentioned, as far as support, bipartisan is a big part. So there's 82% of Democrats and 64% of Republicans and independents who support this bill. But the other thing that's interesting is the percentage when you break down demographics, and every major demographic supports this bill. So over 70% of adults in the United States support this bill, and that includes males, females, younger, middle age, high, low income, urban and rural. All of those different categories support it. And then I also threw in a couple percentages there for different people who identify either as hunters, anglers, bird watchers, or wildlife viewers. And again, the theme here is the overwhelming support for this bill. The person who is on there as a co-sponsor that I picked was Sherrod Brown, who's a Democrat from Ohio. I picked him because even though I now live in Alaska, I grew up and was raised in Ohio. None of the Alaskan senators are listed as co-sponsors, but Sherrod Brown from Ohio is. And this does make sense to me because he is part of the Agriculture and Forestry committees. And he's also worked on other conservation efforts, especially with Lake Erie, which is along the northern border of Ohio. So how can RAWA become a law? Same thing and same way that any other bill would become a law. So it's got to go through the House of Representatives and the Senate with a majority vote. So in the House, that would be 218 or more votes, and in the Senate, that would be 51 or more votes. Once it makes it through those 2 stages, it'll go to the president for approval. If he approves it, it becomes a law. If he does not and vetoes it, it would go back to the House and the Senate and would need to get a 2/3 percentage vote from both of them. At that stage, it would become a law. The main criticism of the bill is where the funding comes from, and an example of that is in the 117th Congress recently. They proposed that they could generate the revenue for it from cryptocurrency sales, and there was a lot of debate on if they wanted to do that or not. And ultimately, they couldn't agree, which is why it was left out of the final spending bill. But even if you look back historically, this bill has failed because of where to pull the money from and the inability to agree on that. STWGs and SWAPs, the state and wildlife tribal wildlife grants, and the state wildlife action plans. So the state and tribal wildlife grants essentially were and have been what have been used in lieu of having a bill like the RAWA implemented and passed. So since 2000, when Congress created this grant program, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been sending these grants out to different states and territories based on their size and population, and it's funding their ability to work on conservation efforts. They also offer some additional funding through competitive grant programs with that, and annually that equals out to about $70 million. These state wildlife action plans are kind of a sub piece of that, where they develop a plan based on the species of greatest conservational need in their state, and then they outline that, they submit it, and then the state wildlife action plans are developed, and that allows them to specifically focus on and attack these species of greatest needs to see if they can bring up those population numbers or enact certain types of conservational efforts to help out those species of greatest need. Here in Alaska, the species of greatest need that I picked is the Steller sea lion. They're found out throughout the Aleutian Islands and the Gulf of Alaska. They definitely prefer the colder subarctic waters. And there's two general populations. The main one that's been in decline is the western segment. They've declined 75% since 1975, with a 40% reduction between 1991 and 2000. The Steller sea lions are typically killed because of illegal killings, gas and oil extractions, and then strikes from boats. And then the state tribal wildlife grant project in Alaska that I chose is the Kwalalangan tribe in Unalaska, which is where I used to live, received part of the $1.3 million that was granted to Alaskan Native tribes. And they are using it to study and do a restoration project on blue mussel habitats in the Unalaska Bay. And they're doing that for the ability to have more subsistence food and also improve the water quality there. So I want to thank you for your time and allowing me to explain the RAWA and some of how it impacts Alaska and some of the history of it. And here's the works cited. Thank you.